Coming to you from the mountains and the plain, the only conservative voices brave enough to push back. This is the Conservative Daily Podcast with Joe Otto.
That's what the Second Amendment was designed to do. If you're going to do something to nullify or take away my rights under the Constitution, come get it.
Max McGuire.
When you look at politicians on the left, they need to convince people that they are victims.
A resistance to the resistance. And now your hosts, Joe Otto and Max McGuire.
And welcome back to another edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. My name is Max McGuire. This is a special edition of the podcast. It's a weekend edition. We don't do these often, but I feel like there's too much going on not to talk about some stuff. So we're going to see how these go. It'll probably just be me doing the weekend editions. We don't have a call-in number because I'm just at my house doing this, and we don't have the ability to stream to YouTube. So these are just going to be on Facebook for the time being. But welcome everyone. Happy Saturday. I want to talk today and do something a little bit different than what we usually do. We usually do breaking news events, the stories of the day. I'd like to use these weekends as opportunities to talk more about history, talk more about political science, theory, broader things that aren't necessarily super timely, this one is, but are just really interesting topics that I wish we'd be able to talk about on the podcast if we weren't bogged down in obviously important stuff, right? The election being stolen. We can't just ignore that. We have to keep covering because every day we learn more and more and more. But in a world where we didn't have to focus on what the Democrats were doing, what spineless Republicans were doing, I'd like to use these weekends as a chance to kind of talk about bigger issues, history, fun things that my political science nerd brain finds very interesting. And today we've kind of teased this a little bit on the podcast in previous days, but today I want to talk about the election of 1876. Now, I don't expect everyone to know a lot about the election of 1876. Some media outlets have started reporting on it now, but it's really interesting. It's the last time that Congress has gotten involved to decide the winner of a presidential contest. 1876 was the last time. There were two other times previously. I don't remember those dates off the top of my head, but one was, I believe, like 1800, early 1800s. It's really interesting because the Constitution, as we've all talked about, we have the Electoral College. And the Electoral College states that each individual state will have a certain number of electors, and the number of electors is determined by a formula. The number of senators the state has plus the number of congressmen, right? That's how you get to the number of we're getting back up and running. Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulties. So that's kind of the formula for the Electoral College. The number of senators plus the number of congressmen, that's how you get to the Electoral College number of electors. So right now, that number sits at 538. That's the number of representatives in the House of Representatives plus senators. And I believe, D.C. gets a couple, so that's how you get to 538. But it wasn't always at 538. It used to be a different number. And as more states have been added to the United States, as the House of Representatives grew, right, as the Senate grew, the number of electors in the Electoral College grew as well. So when you realize back in 1876, the magic number wasn't 578. I'll put it up right now. The magic number was much lower. It was much lower, and I don't have the number on there. I believe it was like 160, 170. Somewhere in there was your magic number to win the presidency in 1876. This is the actual Electoral College map from 1876. This is the final version. And there was a lot of controversy in this election that we're going to talk about because it really does mimic what we're seeing today. So, but before we can really get into that, we have to talk about what the country looked like going into the election. Obviously, realize that the Civil War had only ended 11 years prior. And while that might seem like a long time, it wasn't. In terms of post-Civil War America, Reconstruction South, it wasn't. So this was a period known as Reconstruction, where the Northern Army, the United States Army, still occupied the South of the United States. Now, why were they occupying the South? What was Reconstruction all about? So a large part of Reconstruction was to literally rebuild the South. That's a depiction of Sherman's March to the Sea. Anyone who doesn't know about General Sherman's march, he waged total war against the South. Here's a map. His goal was he was going to go from Atlanta all the way to the ocean, and he was going to burn every single town, village, city in his way. And he was going to bring the South to its knees by literally burning down northern Georgia. So that was Sherman's March to Sea. So part of Reconstruction was, yes, we have to rebuild the South, because after the war, the South was completely devastated. Not just because of Sherman, but also because of other aspects of the war as well. But another aspect of Reconstruction was teaching the South how to actually live in a post-war America. And what I mean by that is African Americans were no longer slaves. A lot of people in the South didn't like that. They didn't like that. So they kept trying to find workarounds, right? So they weren't slaves, but they would make them like indentured servants. Really crazy stuff to get them to keep working basically for free on plantations. They didn't want to give them the right to vote. All these problems in the Reconstruction South. So the Northern Army stayed there to not only keep the peace, not only rebuild after the war, but also to ensure that the South didn't slide back into its old ways of slavery and discrimination. And we'll see that, unfortunately, the election of 1876 really hurt Reconstruction efforts, because by the end of this election, it was actually a negotiation at the end. The Republican won the election and had to agree to take troops out of the South, which ended up leading to the Jim Crow era as we know it. So who was running for president in 1876? We had the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. Look at that man's beard. Now, that man has a glorious beard. Rutherford B. Hayes was the governor of Ohio, and he was running for president, and he was the Republican nominee. Now, President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, thought about running for a third term, but opted not to. His administration was plagued with corruption. He would have been the first to run for a third term. He thought about it, but ultimately he said, you know what? The Republican Party has a much better chance of winning if I'm not on the ticket, because these stories of corruption keep plaguing my administration. And many of them were completely justified. Like, I believe at least one or two people might have actually even been impeached. I don't know if they were removed, but there were many efforts to hold these administration officials in contempt. And it was legitimate. They were corrupt people. So Rutherford B. Hayes got the nod from the Republican Party, and he was set to go up after a man by the last name of Tilden. Actually, I completely forget his last name. It's amazing how you forget people's first names. Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden, I believe, yes, the governor of New York. So Samuel Tilden was the Democrat nominee. He was going to try and retake the presidency after the Civil War. Now, we all know this, but Democrats were the party of the South. They were the party of slavery. They were the party of discrimination. So after the Civil War, Democrats did not win elections. They won here and there, especially local stuff, but they did not take the presidency for a long time after the Civil War. So Samuel Tilden got the nod from the Democrats. And if you're just going to kind of compare the two, I'd say if I knew nothing about this, I would have given it to Rutherford B. Hayes just because of how awesome his beard is. The problem is there was also a third party candidate in the race from the Greenback Party, a man who goes by the name of Peter Cooper. And if we're just going to judge beards, if beards are the only thing that qualifies someone to be president, that man's beard is awesome. Look at that. That's like Santa got struck by lightning. That is an incredible beard. And he got the nod for the Greenback Party. We don't have to go too far into it, but the Greenback Party was all about getting off the gold standard and having a fluctuating currency. So instead of trying to devalue the currency and keep it set to a gold standard, they wanted to have inflation. They felt that inflation was healthy. So Cooper got the nod from the Greenback Party. The only reason I brought him up is because his beard is awesome. And he did get 1% of the popular vote, which did help the Republican. Did help Rutherford B. Hayes in many of these states. But I want to put up his face because it is an awesome, awesome beard. So what happened in this election? This election, let me put up the map again. This is the final results. And you can see that the biggest outliers here in these election results. By the way, this was the first election that Colorado was actually a state. And interesting little factoid, anyone who likes trivia, Colorado at that point hadn't been a state long enough to set its own election laws. So in Colorado, the presidential electors were actually decided by the legislature. It's the last time in American history that has happened because Colorado didn't have a law in place to set up elections and everything. That's how freshly into the Union Colorado was. the last instance where a state legislature actually picked the electors without even asking people to vote. But other than that little factoid, the biggest thing that should jump out at you, beyond the fact that New York went blue, obviously because Tilden was the governor of New York, the biggest thing that jumps out at you is Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. Those are the 3 red states, Republican-won states, in the South. Now, how does that happen? That didn't happen by popular vote. In all 3 of those states, Democrats, Tilden, actually won the election. People went out and voted. At the end of the whole count, Tilden was declared the winner. The difference was that in these 3 states, while there were Democrats in control of the local and the county positions, Republicans controlled the legislature. Again, this is something that happened after the Civil War. Republicans swept through pretty much all of the legislatures in the South. It took Democrats a little bit of time to get back in it, but those 3 states had Republican legislatures. And those Republican legislatures started looking at the results of the election, and they didn't like what they were seeing. They were seeing voter fraud. They were seeing voter intimidation from Democrats working at the county and local levels. And they were seeing Democrats trying to frighten black people away from voting for a Republican. Does any of this sound familiar? It should. Very, very similar to what we're seeing today, except instead of it being 3 states today, it's 4. It's Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. But in 1876, it was 3: Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida. So what happened? In those 3 states, the governors ended up certifying those results as counted and declared Tilden, the Democrat, to be the winner. But the Republican legislatures said, whoa, 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 we don't trust these results. Rampant voter fraud, voter intimidation. The results are illegitimate. We're going to certify our own slate of electors for Rutherford B. Hayes. So this is big because this is a possibility of what could happen this year if, say, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, if their legislatures were to become convinced, hey, we can't trust the results of this election, there's just too many irregularities, it is possible that they could certify a different slate of electors. So what ended up happening, let me put up this is the picture we saw at the beginning. This is what it looked like in Congress, complete pandemonium, because according to the Constitution, if you send different slates of electors, it's up to Congress to decide. Specifically, it's actually up to the president of the Senate, who is the vice president. So again, if this happens again this year, where let's say Georgia, the Georgia legislature says Trump won, the Secretary of State certifies that Biden won. If they both send that, it'll be up to Pence really to decide which slate of electors to choose as the legitimate one. It's very interesting. We haven't really had too many instances of this and too many needs to kind of reshape what the Constitution says. So that's what happened. The slates of electors came there, and in those 3 states, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, there were 2 separate slates of electors, one for the Democrat, one for the Republican. And they're trying to figure out, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Because without those electors filled, neither candidate would have the necessary electors to win in the Electoral College. Until those 3 were decided, both of them were below the 50% mark, and neither could be declared president. So it could have gone to the House, and they could have done it, but they wanted to settle which slate of electors was legitimate. So they actually created a commission. They created a commission. Let me get rid of this other picture. A commission of these fine gentlemen. Their names aren't really that important. The important part is that it was basically split along party lines. The commission had 1 more Republican than Democrat. And not surprisingly, that commission, in the end, found, on a completely party line vote, with 1 extra Republican voting, the commission found that Rutherford B. Hayes was the winner, that the legislature's slates of electors should be counted, not the ones that were decided by voter fraud. So it's an interesting thing to look at, because obviously this is so long ago. You think that this could never happen again. But we're seeing many of the same phenomenon happening today. Democrats, eager to get control of power back, right? Just like we saw in the Reconstruction South, Democrats were so eager to retake power after the Civil War that we saw voter fraud in 1876, where they were literally stuffing the ballot box. Now think about what you're hearing from Michigan, people swearing under oath in affidavits, sworn affidavits, that they saw boxes and boxes of unmarked ballots or basically suspect ballots arriving in the dead of night, that they saw election workers scanning the same ballot multiple times. Like there's one affidavit in Michigan of actually, amazingly, a Dominion voting systems contractor. Yes, one of Dominion voting systems contractors who was sent to Wayne County, Michigan to make sure that the whole system stayed up and running during the whole thing. She swore in an affidavit that she watched people scan the same box of ballots 4 or 5 times. And we know that Dominion's system allows for the same ballot to be voted multiple times, tabulated multiple times, and to count. That's one of the reasons that the UK doesn't want to use Dominion voting systems, because they realize you could put the same ballot through twice, even if accidentally, and it would count it as 2 votes. So when you see what they were doing with stuffing the ballot box, when you see what they were doing disenfranchising Black Americans, we're not seeing that too much now, but especially when it comes to intimidation. You look at what Joe Biden did on on election day. Typically, presidential candidates are not supposed to campaign on election day. He went to Pennsylvania and he campaigned on election day, breaking the norm in Philadelphia. What did Kamala Harris do? She went to Michigan to pressure African Americans to vote for their campaign. So it's not the same as voter intimidation, because in the South, literally in 1876, you had them waving guns at Black Americans trying to vote, right? Like it doesn't reach that level, but you still see the same kind of intimidation. We see it from the media. We saw it from Democrats all year. Joe Biden's famous line, if you can't tell the difference between whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black. It's a more subtle form of intimidation, but it's still there. This idea that your blackness depends on you voting Democrat. So what ultimately happened? It went to that commission, one extra Republican, then Democrat on the commission, and the commission decided that it was going to be, they were going to give it to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. And that is how you get to this map. Let me pull it back up again. That's how you get to this map. That is why Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida are red on the map. It's not because their constituents voted that way. It's because the legislature stepped in and said, too much fraud, too much abuse, too much intimidation for us to possibly trust these results. We think it was the opposite. We're going to submit our own slate. And then the United States Senate deciding, yes, we're going to go with that slate. Well, not the Senate, but that commission. But here's the really sad part. The really sad part is that Democrats basically flipped out. And honestly, I can understand that. If you are a Democrat not involved in that voter fraud in Louisiana, Florida, or South Carolina, and you hear all of a sudden that Congress has changed the results and that they've decided to give it to the other guy, I would understand as a Democrat being pissed. Listen, if this happens this year, Democrats are going to be very pissed. Right? I can understand that. So there was talk at the time of the United States sliding into another civil war. It's amazing to think, because Rutherford B. Hayes tends to be like a footnote in American history when people study American history, right? You study the Pilgrims, you study the American Revolution, you study the Civil War, you study probably the New Deal, and then you'll jump through into modern politics. And most high schools won't even teach modern politics because they don't want to come off as political. Rutherford B. Hayes tends to be just a footnote. If you were to ask someone to name as many presidents as they can remember, I guarantee you the average person will not name Rutherford B. Hayes. But the interesting part of this is that the way Congress decided this was so contentious that people actually feared that this would slide the country into a second civil war. Again, does it sound familiar? Certainly does to me. So Republicans and Democrats, having given the election to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, away from Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, they decide, okay, let's meet behind closed doors and see if we can come to an arrangement to stop another civil war from breaking out. And the arrangement that was reached was in exchange for Democrats giving up their protest of how the election was decided. Instead, Democrats would agree to give up their protest. In exchange, Republicans would agree to withdraw all Union troops from the Reconstruction South. Think about this. And this is why this is actually really depressing to talk about this, because if this compromise wasn't reached, I think a lot of the pain and a lot of the suffering that we saw in the Jim Crow South could have been avoided. Those results in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina could not be trusted because local Democrats were threatening black voters to stop them from voting and were stuffing the ballots. And the solution to that fraud was to take the only real federal law enforcement presence out of the South. And what followed, predictably, was more discrimination, was more attempts to drag people back into slavery, not slavery by name, but slavery by other names, right? And to basically set up that whole separate but equal that we ultimately saw the Supreme Court rubber stamp. All of that, the Jim Crow South, discrimination in the South, leading up to Martin Luther King, all that was made possible because Republicans agreed to withdraw their troops, the Union's troops, from the Reconstruction South. So it's interesting because this is such an important moment in history that doesn't get taught a whole lot. And when you look at where we are today, we owe so much of where we are today to that decision, right? Imagine if we never had a civil rights movement because they worked this out in the late 1800s. Imagine if we never had Martin Luther King, or if Martin Luther King was doing something else, because we'd stopped separate but equal. We'd stopped discrimination. We'd stopped black separate water fountains, right? We stopped all of that after the Civil War, but we didn't get a chance to because the Republicans had to create that compromise to stop apparently a second Civil War. I don't know how much I believe that, but it was definitely a fear at the time that there would be a second Civil War. Now, how does this all kind of shape into what we're seeing today? What we're seeing today is actually very similar. We're seeing today that we have Republican legislatures in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. They have Democrat governors, and there are credible accusations of voter fraud. There are irregularities that cannot be regularly explained. Now, what do I mean by that? In Pennsylvania, we're seeing reports that the amount of spoiled ballots, absentee ballots being thrown out for not being submitted correctly, is right around 0.5%. But if you go back to 2016, I believe, and I might be off by 0.1%, but I believe the number of spoiled ballots in Pennsylvania was around 3.5%. So 3% of the ballots that you would expect to have been thrown out, not for illegitimate reasons, but they forgot to sign it, they forgot to use the secrecy sleeve, it wasn't postmarked correctly, all these different things, the signatures didn't match, all things that can throw out ballots. We're seeing in Pennsylvania that overwhelmingly the people responsible for deciding what ballots count, the canvassers, what ballots will count, what ballots won't, are giving voters the benefit of the doubt. We're seeing this in Nevada too, where they actually have a machine, artificial intelligence, that instead of having someone look at the signatures and compare them personally, it's a machine that photographs the signature on the ballot, compares it to the database of that voter's signature on their voter registration or on their request for an absentee ballot, and uses software to say whether or not they're the same. Well, in Nevada, that software system was throwing up so many red flags that the workers actually turned it down. They turned the sensitivity down. So the software was working too well. Like, and this makes sense. Like, if you write your same signature a couple times, chances are there are tiny mistakes, tiny changes in how you do it. No one writes the same signature every single time they do a signature. In Nevada, they actually turned the sensitivity of the machine down. I've heard that they've turned it down as low as 40%. Now think about that. Imagine if you were working an election and someone said, hey, too many of these ballots don't have matching signatures. And imagine if the manager's response was, okay, disregard their last name, right? Just disregard 50% of it and just judge the first name. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about. The act of turning down the sensitivity of the machine. Interestingly enough, the act of turning down that sensitivity kind of calls into question whether or not the machine is still certified. Remember, these machines have to be certified. Infamously, the GOP forgot to send a representative, at least in Maricopa County, in Clark County. I'm thinking of Arizona. They did send it in Clark County, Nevada. It's certified, though, at a certain sensitivity. So when you reduce that sensitivity, there's real questions of whether or not that certification still stands. Similarly to Georgia, right? The Georgia machines were certified as, yep, we think they're accurate. The night before the election, Dominion Voting Systems pushed a software update. Well, no, you can't push a software update. It means that the machines aren't certified anymore. If you use a machine and you test it and you put it through its paces, you say, okay, it works. It's putting out an accurate tally no matter how many ballots we throw through it. And then hours before election day starts, a company changes the software, that machine isn't certified anymore. So we're getting kind of off on a little tangent here, but the reason it's important is because you have those 4 states. You have Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, where there's Republican legislatures but Democrat governors. So if the Democrat governors decide to certify those results, it will then be up to the Republican legislatures to decide whether or not to go along with it, or to say there's too much fraud, too many allegations of abuse, irregularities for us to say that this is legitimate. We're going to certify the alternative slate. We're going to give it to Donald Trump. What would happen then, as we said, it would go to Congress, and it would be up to the president of the Senate, Mike Pence, to decide which slate of electors should be counted. I mean, it's crazy, this idea that Mike Pence would be able to decide that, oh no, yep, vote for me. But that's how the Constitution is written. So in that case, I mean, it gets really complicated, because if Congress cannot come up with a compromise, right? If Congress cannot reach an agreement on who it believes should be certified, or if the Electoral College cannot give the win to one candidate or the other, then it comes up to Congress in a separate process to decide the election itself, right? So what we've been talking about is certifying the electors, right? If Congress cannot certify the electors, or the electors cannot reach an agreement on which candidate has the majority of votes, then it's up to Congress to vote for president itself, right? Take the Electoral College out of it. Sorry, Electoral College, you failed. It's up to Congress to vote. And the way it works in Congress is every senator gets a vote, but in the House, every congressman does not. It goes by state. Each state gets one vote. And it's up to the delegation from that state to vote amongst itself and decide which party to give its vote to. So interestingly enough, Republicans are gaining seats in the House of Representatives. I think I saw it was up to like 14 today. And that's what's so crazy. Donald Trump is supposed to have lost the election, but Republicans gained 14 seats in the House. And Joe Biden underperformed in every single metro area except for Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta, and Philadelphia. All cities that have gross irregularities, voter fraud allegations, using Dominion voting systems machines. Come on, guys. Republicans aren't going to come a couple of seats away from retaking the House and have Joe Biden surge to victory. It just, there's too many irregularities. So, but if the Senate, if we can't decide which slate to seat, and the Electoral College can't decide amongst itself who gets the majority, each senator gets a vote. And as I said, in the House, each state gets a vote, and the state delegation decides which party to give their vote to. Republicans, right now, and I believe in the next Congress, when the next Congress is seated at the start of the year, Republicans will control a majority of the state delegations, meaning that if it's put up to a vote in Congress to decide who is the president, Republicans will win the day. As long as Republicans don't vote Democrat, which, listen, don't put it past them. Never vote against a Republican losing his spine and voting with a Democrat. It's always possible. But if it's purely a party line vote and the election were to go to the House, Donald Trump would win. And then in the Senate, even if you had a couple defections, Mike Pence would be able to break the tie to reelect himself as vice president. Right? So if it goes to Congress, that's how it would probably go. But let's say that they're still deadlocked. Let's say that in the midst of all this, no one can decide. The Senate can't decide. The House can't decide. The Electoral College can't decide. No matter what they do, no matter how many deliberations they have, they cannot decide who actually won the election. Well, this is where it gets really, really terrifying. If a president, you can never have a moment in American history, you cannot have a moment in this country where there is not a president. That is why we have the line of succession. There has to be a president at any given moment. Obviously, it's possible that a president could die and it could take a couple minutes for whoever's next in line to get sworn in. Sure. But you can't leave the presidency empty. You cannot leave the resolute desk empty for any significant amount of time. So the way the founders have worked through this is if Congress cannot decide, if the House and Senate cannot decide, if the Electoral College cannot decide by Inauguration Day, then by constitutional requirement, the Speaker of the House becomes president temporarily until they can work out their differences and elect a duly elected president. So this is why it's so terrifying, because if this goes to Congress and if by whatever reason the Electoral College can't provide a winner and Congress can't provide a winner, can't actually choose a winner, Nancy Pelosi becomes president. Well, I don't want to, let me take a step back. Nancy Pelosi has not won re-election as Speaker of the House yet. She is currently running unopposed. So as long as Democrats hold on to their majority in the House of Representatives, which it looks like they will do, albeit very narrowly compared to what election night looked like, if Democrats hold on to their majority, and if no one challenges Nancy Pelosi as it currently sits in that scenario where the Electoral College cannot provide a majority either candidate and Congress cannot work out a winner, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, would become president until they could get their act together. And that is terrifying. That is absolutely terrifying. But that's the way our system runs. And we don't really have a lot of history in having elections run like this. Again, there were three. Let me just get the dates, because 1876 is the one. I think 1802. Let me look it up. There's three in American history. No, 1824 was one, and I believe there was another one in the early 1800s as well. There was three. So it doesn't happen that often. It doesn't happen that often where Congress has to step in and decide, because as broken as the Electoral College is, they still have all but three times come up with a winner. Interestingly enough, though, I mean, if you really wanted the Electoral College to decide a winner, you would have mandated that there be an odd number of electors, right? Right now it's 538. Through our entire history, there's been an even number of electors, meaning it's possible to tie. You can be 269, 269. It was a possibility this time around that they could have tied. Trump and Biden could have tied. It's a real likelihood. So at the same time, if you think, well, this is horrible, we shouldn't do it this way. Well, if that was the case, the founders never would have set it up so that it was possible to tie. They would have made it an odd number of Electoral College electors, and that would have just settled it. So, I mean, this is by design. Just because we haven't gotten to this point too many times in our history doesn't mean that it isn't by design. Is this possible? Will this happen? Listen, right now, the odds of a recount, a redo of the election, not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Secretary of State of Pennsylvania is refusing to even do a recount. She's not going to order a redo of the election. And even if the legislature decided to have a redo, the governor would just veto it, right? Republicans don't have that many seats in the legislature. So a redo, it's not going to happen. It should. It really should. You should have everyone revote and have to do it in person with voter ID, right? I mean, that's the way our election just should be run anyway. But there's not going to be a revote. There's really two avenues for Trump to win. Either the Supreme Court tossing out a certain number of ballots, which, again, it's a legitimate gripe from the Trump campaign. If they counted over 650,000 ballots in Philadelphia and Allegheny County after forcibly removing GOP poll watchers and challengers from the room, right? It's a legitimate gripe. Saying, well, how can you count votes if the law says we have to be able to observe it, and you kick us out of the room and you vote them in secret and you count them in secret? How are those legitimate ballots, right? And if Philadelphia has started destroying envelopes, as we've heard, then yes, those ballots should be thrown out. That the Supreme Court could intervene and toss out ballots. Will they? That's where it gets really dicey. Typically, the Supreme Court doesn't want to take up a case unless it can actually change the outcome of the election. That's why the Supreme Court is still very hesitant to decide whether or not to allow those late arriving ballots to be counted in Pennsylvania, because even if it is unconstitutional under Pennsylvania's constitution, the Supreme Court isn't going to get involved to toss out 10,000 ballots if Joe Biden is winning by more than that, right? It's just, they're not going to do it. So that's where it gets challenging, right? Sure, they can do it. Lower courts have so far tossed out most of Trump's challenges. I don't think he's won one in Pennsylvania, but everything else that's actually been decided has been tossed out. I mean, you expect it. Does anyone really think that a county judge or a superior judge is going to throw out an entire state's election results? No lower judge would ever do that. It's going to take getting up to the upper levels of the court system or going through federal court. So it's still entirely possible. More likely, though, is going through the route of 1876. It would be messy. It would be frustrating. It'd be terrifying in many ways. But this is a much more predictable, a much more likely outcome. If we're looking for how Trump wins the presidency at this point, that model, 1876, is the way that it would most likely be done because he has Republican legislatures in all the states in question. All the states where there is fraud being identified, all the states where there are irregularities that can't be explained, all the states that happen to just use Dominion voting systems just conveniently, right? There are Republican legislatures. The question is, do those GOP state reps and state senators have the cojones to do what is right and ensure that a fraudulent winner like Joe Biden is not inaugurated? Will they have the cojones? I don't know. It's very frustrating. You would hope that they would, but I have had my heart broken by Republicans unwilling to do Republican things so many times that you can't just assume that they're ever going to do the right thing. Sherry says in the comment section, please explain the 1876 model again. Basically, the idea is that if legislatures decide that they don't trust the actual vote tallies, legislatures can send an alternate slate of delegates, as happened in 1876 in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. They send an alternate slate, and that's up to Congress to decide which slate is the legitimate ones. And in Congress, Mike Pence would have the power to at least do that on the Senate side. So there is still a pathway for this to happen. Actually, I think Mike Pence would decide for the entire Congress. The president of the Senate would decide for the whole Congress. So if that was to reach Mike Pence and he was to decide, who won Georgia, Republicans or Democrats, he would choose Republicans. And that would be the slate that would be put to a vote for certification in Congress. The challenge is that if Congress doesn't go along with it, or if the Electoral College still can't decide who the winner is, then Nancy Pelosi would become president until they figured it out. Yeah, you can rewatch the video. That's basically the synopsis of it. So that's probably the best path forward for Trump. And again, it's very messy. It's going to be very hard to herd those cats. I mean, you think whipping up votes is hard in the United States Congress? Imagine whipping up votes in at that point 8 different state legislatures, because remember, each state has 2. Each state has 2 chambers. Whipping up votes in 8 legislatures for Republicans that many of them are never Trumpers, right? They're not all pro-Trump Republicans. We never really got to purge the traitors out of the party. And they're licking their lips hoping that they can come right in if Trump loses. So it'll still be very hard. But you don't need all 4. You don't need all 4. You need 3. You need Pennsylvania, absolutely. Georgia, absolutely. If the recount doesn't have Trump win, you need Georgia. And then you need Wisconsin or Michigan. I think that the better argument is people asking, why is Michigan, Wisconsin red on a map? This is the 1876 map. Also why there's no such thing as New Mexico on the map, because they hadn't become states yet. If you're looking at whether Michigan or Wisconsin would kind of step in and their legislatures do this, I think there's a good case in both, right? There's people on the record. There's Dominion, as I said, there's a Dominion contractor. Her name is, I think, Melissa Cardoni. Might have mispronounced the name, just going off memory. There is a Dominion contractor hired to run the system in, I believe, Wayne County, literally testifying that there was fraud taking place right in front of her. That's Michigan, right? In Wisconsin, we talked about this on the podcast yesterday or the day before, the idea that in Milwaukee, the head of elections misplaced the thumb drive, the hard drive that was used to hold the final tabulation. She misplaced it for what she at least admits was 10 minutes, probably was longer. It went outside the chain of custody. And when police were figured out about it, they tried to call it in, and allegedly the election officials told them to stand down. Don't worry, we'll find it eventually. So that whole thumb drive removed from the chain of custody, do you allow those votes to count if you cannot trust that they're real? I don't know, that's the argument to make. Because right around that time when they rediscovered that thumb drive is when Joe Biden miraculously overtook Donald Trump's lead in the 3 a.m. hour in Wisconsin. It was the contents of the thumb drive that gave Joe Biden those 140,000 uncontested votes. I mean, these are crazy numbers, right? So when you see the irregularities and you match it up to it being removed from the chain of custody, and you match it up to the fact that the election officials didn't want the police to call it in, didn't want to make it to become an official thing, there's an argument in Wisconsin as well that you cannot trust the results. Will we be able to convince those legislatures? I don't know, but it has to get started now, right? That campaign has to start now. Trump campaign is doing a very good job of highlighting the irregularities, the fraud, the problems with how ballots were handled. They have to start launching that campaign to actually convince the legislatures to actually step in and say, no, we don't trust these results. They have to be thrown out. Or to at least try and say, no, we need a revote. And when the governor vetoes it, which they would in all 4 of these states, Georgia they might, but Georgia's governor has been really flaky lately. I'm really disappointed in him. After that, if they fail to get a redo, that I could see it, but I can't see them jumping right to it. It has to be a step. The whole thing is you have to put pressure on them. So if you live in one of these 4 states, if you live in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, or Georgia, put pressure on your state legislatures now. These are fraudulent results. They cannot be trusted. The irregularities cannot be explained, and that they cannot, in good conscience, certify those results. Nick Clark asking, were those 138,000 votes attached to that thumb drive? That's the ultimate question. We don't know how many, but we do know that that thumb drive was included in the tally that ultimately put Joe Biden ahead. When they counted all those votes in the middle of the night in Wisconsin and Joe Biden, whoop, that thumb drive was included in it. And right now, Joe Biden's lead only stands at 20,000 votes in Wisconsin. So it isn't hard to see how that lead could evaporate. Even if that thumb drive didn't count for all the votes, it's easy to see how Joe Biden's lead could evaporate if that thumb drive is taken out of the equation for being removed from the chain of custody. Carl says, what states again? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia. Nothing to do with the map at all. So I hope this was helpful. If you liked this weekend content, let me know. We'll do more of them. I think it'd be fun to do one on history, maybe a Saturday one on history, maybe a Sunday one more on like political theory. Maybe we talk about some political philosophers. We've mentioned it on the show a couple times in the last couple of weeks. Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Maybe we talk a bit about that. I mean, maybe this becomes, I don't know, a book club where I give out recommendations on things to read, and then maybe we come and talk about them. I think that'd be fun. And again, my idea of fun is a little warped and twisted, I admit. But let me know if you'd like that. Maybe we plan that on a Saturday or Sunday, we'll talk about this, and then I can provide you all a link to it. Because most of these things, if you're talking about like Plato's Republic or Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, they're all in the public domain at this point. So it's very easy to get them online where you don't have to pay for it. I think that'd be fun. Treat this almost like not a lecture, but a discussion, right? Actually kind of treat it like the Socratic method, right? Talking about it, asking questions. I think that'd be fun. So let me know if you like that idea. We can do that. We can do a history one day, a political theory or philosophy another, and go from there. But I enjoy this. I like being able to take a step back away from the kind of stories of the day, just talk about bigger issues and bigger things. I think it is fun, and it gives me a chance just to take a step back and kind of just do stream of consciousness, because I don't have a script. There's no teleprompter for me today. There's no script. I kind of thought about what I wanted to say going into this, and yeah, sure, it flubs up parts of it. Probably be a little bit more cohesive if it has a script. But this is just stream of consciousness, just me kind of talking about what I know and sharing a little bit of it. So let me know if you like this and if you want more, and we'll definitely do it. So the last bit today is there's very good news to share. So we've been really hyping up our audio version of the podcast, which if you don't already subscribe to our audio version of the podcast on Apple Podcasts, please do it. There's a link in the description. And so we've been really hyping it up the last couple of weeks, and I'm happy to say that today we are now number 53 in the United States. We are the 53rd most popular podcast on Apple Podcasts, which is the biggest distributor of audio podcasts. So thank you. Wouldn't have been possible without all of your guys' help. If you aren't already subscribed to the podcast and you have an iPhone or a MacBook, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts. If you don't have an iPhone or MacBook, that's fine. You can also subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on the Google Play Store. Let me see if I can remember. Usually I read this part off. Google Play Store, Spotify. Listen on Spotify now. Pandora, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, as well as the Podbean app. We're also going to start streaming these on our website. We're able with our software to stream to 3 different places at once. I am at home, so I don't have access to software. We're just doing Facebook on these weekend ones. I'll post the video to YouTube afterwards. But we're also going to start streaming to our website, conservative-daily.com. In the event that Facebook takes us down or YouTube takes us down, there's at least a place where we can keep having these discussions and keep broadcasting these shows. So that's coming down the pike. I think we actually broadcast yesterday's on our website. I haven't checked it out yet, but that's going to be happening soon too. You can also text Freedom to 89517 and receive text alerts. We don't have the text alerts over the weekend. Maybe I'll start doing it. It's just a lot of prep to do on my own. But if you text Freedom to 89517, you will get text alerts when we go live on weekdays. Absolutely, for sure. There's also a link to join our email newsletter. And we are on Parler at Conservative Daily. Tons of people following us on Parler. We have a rule that if you follow us, we will happily follow you back. Actually, I can't say happily anymore because it is getting really tiresome. I mean, it's good news, right? It's good to have so many people following us that my thumbs falling asleep just clicking the button to follow people back. But that's the good part of growth. If you follow us on Parler, we'll be happy to follow you back. So that's going to be it for this weekend edition, little history story time hour of the Conservative Daily Podcast. My name is Max McGuire. Remember, everyone, that the fight to take back our country isn't over. But as we just saw from this little story, 1876, this isn't the first time it's happened either. And the only way we win is if we all stand up and fight together.